Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, and dear participants, welcome to NICE webinar on radicalism in Pakistan. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We vision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Sorry. There is increasing radicalism around the world, especially in South Asia. We are more prone to it. We can see similar trend in almost all the Southeastern countries. Hence, in this context, to talk on the radicalism in Pakistan, we have invited a very renowned scholar and expert, Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa. We'd like to welcome Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa to today's program, and we are thankful to her for providing her valuable time. Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa holds PhD in War Studies from King's College London and is author of 2 amazing books, including international acclaimed Military Incorporation, Expertise in Military Decision Making, Defense Economics, Civil Military Relations, and Militancy and Extremism in South Asia and in the Middle East. She has also authored 12 book chapters and published over 300 articles in academic journals and opinion pieces in leading national and international outlets, including the New York Times, Al-Jazeera, the Indian Express, the Hindu, the Dawn, Jan's Defense Weekly, Kafila, Le Monde Diplomatique, the News, Tehelka, Himal, OpenDemocracy, Outlook India, and many others. She is a regular contributor to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute Counter-Terrorism yearbook for 2018 and 2019. She is the only woman and civilian to work with Pakistan Navy as Director of Naval Research. She has worked as an advisor to the Chairman of National Accountability Bureau, Pakistan's Anti-Corruption Watchdog. She has been associated with the Department of the Auditor General of Pakistan for 10 years as part of Pakistan's prestigious civil service. Dr. Siddiqa, you have around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussions. I would like to request all our participants to drop their questions below the Facebook Live or in Zoom chat box by selecting everyone so that everyone can view your questions. Ma'am, your time starts now.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaswal and your center, Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. Thank you for inviting me and asking me to talk about radicalism in Pakistan. I mean, indeed, when you sent me this invite for a minute, I was like, radicalism, I mean, how important it is, especially for a country where the claim is that the violence has reduced. I mean, as compared to Pakistan, as compared to, say, even 5 years ago, violence, terrorism, extremism seem to be the flavor of the society, the flavor of the day, which, and the numbers now are very helpful. The numbers have violence caused by extremism, by terrorism have. Now, what it has done essentially is taken attention away from a much larger and much deeper set problem of radicalism. And if you look at radicalism, I think this is important, an important subject to talk about, because you see it spread all across South Asia. I mean, from Hindutva in India to Buddhist religious institutions getting powerful and more assertive, more negatively assertive in countries like Sri Lanka or Myanmar, and of course there is Pakistan, which has had a head start in a radical ideology, that has been around for many years. The other thing is that what I was reminded about, what I was uncomfortably reminded of, that radicalism is a real problem and cannot be ignored despite lowered numbers of violence, is the incidents that happen every day. I mean, it's just 10 days ago that the government of Pakistan had to kind of covert to pressure from the religious clergy groups, militant radical groups, to turn away, to turn away from its decision to allow Hindus or to the Hindu community to start to build a temple in Islamabad. Otherwise, so there are these developments. Every 2019, just in 2019, 200 Christians in Karachi had to run away from escape from a mob. So these are incidents that happen. These are incidents that happen every day, and it's important to understand that. It's important to understand if it's a phenomenon, if it's an ongoing phenomenon, what does it indicate? Now, let me very quickly through the plan, my presentation plan. What I plan to do is look at 4 issues, which is Pakistan radical? How does one measure radicalism? What are the drivers of radicalism in Pakistan? And is it possible to turn around? Let me get the simplest question out of the way. Is Pakistan radical? And the answer is yes. Its society does differentiate on the and even ethnic beliefs and identities. This has nothing to do with Islam, but the politicization of religion for purposes of power, turned into a hybrid theocratic state, which I define as a socio-political order where, while Sharia law is not entirely enforced, there is little space for rational thought, and societal relationships and resource distribution process is increasingly determined by religious identity. Pakistan, however, is neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia, which are former theocracies. Pakistan is certainly not Saudi Arabia, past and present. It is a country that elected a female. Pakistan is certainly different from the theocratic states, as it elected a female twice as its prime minister. It has women working in judiciary, civil bureaucracy, and even the armed forces. At a time when Saudi Arabia hadn't even given its women right to drive. But unlike modern day Saudi Arabia, Pakistan cannot reconvert itself into a secular liberal space. Secularism, in fact, is defined as lack of faith and hence rejected. So while Riyadh can imagine secularizing its social system and de-radicalize, Pakistan cannot or doesn't have the capacity to do so. In this respect, I find it closer to Israel. I'm leaving details of this equation between Pakistan and Israel, or Pakistan and Iran and Saudi Arabia, for later in my presentation or in Q&A. We can pick it up there. But to put it simply, the strength and evolution of nationalism and its dependence upon religion as a political force view it as a bigger driver of radicalism than poverty or some other factors popularly identified with the problem of radicalism. To understand the above equation, I've borrowed from Michael Mann, who looks at religion as it relates to a network of social political power. Radicalism, mind you, doesn't grow on trees, but is a consequence of how a society engages with religion or uses it to legitimize power relations. This we are observing happening constantly in most countries of South Asia today. Furthermore, I borrow from sociologist Yuri Ram's manipulation of Michael Mann's framework. If political legitimacy is drawn from religious ideology, it has a different impact on consequentialism that emerges as one of the byproducts. Ram has defined four types of nationalisms to indicate interaction between religion and nationalism. So if you look at this matrix, you will see that the first equation is strong nationalism, weak religionism. It's a case of a dominant and energetic secular nationalism. Culturally, it may appropriate some existing religious symbols, but it remolds them to fit the new secular national culture. Institutionally, religious institutions are either entirely separated from the state or made subordinate from it. And the examples are France or Ataturk's Turkey. The second is strong nationalism, strong religionism, case of a fusion that creates a kind of indissoluble mesh of religious nationalism. Then the third type is weak nationalism, weak religionism, case of a polity that is not formed on strong primordial national or religious identity, but is rather constitutionally or contractually oriented. European nations are the case in point. And finally, the fourth, which is the category I believe that Pakistan belongs to, is weak nationalism, strong religionism. Case of primordial, pre-modern and pre-national cultures in which religion was pervasive as a communal post-nationalism identity. As I said, I'd put Pakistan in the fourth category and explain this in a while. But before I do that, let me delve on the second point, which is how to define radicalism in Pakistan. How do you understand it? The legal framework doesn't help with it. That's not where you find the answer. Many of the punishments that are meted out regularly in Saudi Arabia and Iran are not prevalent in Pakistan. Women, of course, have greater space, but radical values exert themselves and are visible in the treatment of minorities, and often women, more so religious minorities. Pakistan, I would like to remind you, is 96.2 to 28% Muslim, out of which about 15 to 20% are Shia, which is the largest concentration of Shias after Iran and Iraq, 0.22% Ahmadiyya, 1.59% Christian, 1.60% Hindus, and apparently there are an odd 800 plus Jews as well, living under different religious identity. Now, the mistreatment of religious minorities is not something that Pakistan started out with. In fact, some of the most significant members of the government under the founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, belonged to minority groups. While Jinnah himself belonged to the Shia community, the country's first foreign minister was Ahmadiyya. Zafarullah Khan, Jogindernath Mandal, a Hindu, was the first law minister. There are still members of minority groups in the government. However, it is not any longer an easy relationship. Conditions since 47 have worsened because of the changing nature of the state. The members of minority groups in noticeable positions are more for showcasing than real adjustment. And this is a story we see happening in countries of the region as well. The uneasy relationship is visible especially from the employment data. According to employment data from a report of 2017 to 19, out of the 581,240 employees of the federal government, only 16,711, which is 2.8%, are non-Muslims. Now, out of these 2.8%, the bulk, which is 13,401, which is about 80%, are employed in the lowest pay scale, grade 1 to 4. Out of the 2.8%, 1.93% are in senior management positions, and only 4 in the highest ranks of bureaucracy, which is basic pay scale 20 to 22. I'm reminded, I'm reminded of my own years in civil bureaucracy, where senior colleagues could not make it beyond a certain pay grade due to their religious identity. The induction of Sikh, Hindus, or Christians in the armed forces is propagated in a manner that doesn't indicate that the minorities are not comfortable in their skins. In any case, the provision of 5% job quota for minorities is not fulfilled. According to the Punjab Public Service Commission report for 2017, out of the 8% posts allocated for minorities, in 2017, 530 remain unfilled due to the lack of qualified people. While politicized, and this is not just a lack of that minorities are not qualified, this is a lot to do with politicization of employment quota, which is a result of not just religious intolerance, but also class bias. Majority of minorities, especially in the largest province of Punjab, are from the lower class. Sindh to the south, if you can make sense of this, if you look towards the southern province of Sindh, you see a different variation. All right, you have it, so that's fine. Okay, shall I go on?
Yes, ma'am, please.
All right. So Sindh in the south is different, as they're middle and upper middle class Hindus in the province. However, there is then another problem in the form of forced conversion, especially of young girls. Reportedly, 1,000 Hindu girls get forcibly converted every year. The government of Sindh tried to pass a law in 2016 against forcible child marriage, but was unable to do so due to competing politics. This is what I say indicates radical values. Prejudice against minorities is also reflected in the educational system. For instance, children are given extra 20 marks for memorizing the Quran, which in itself is contravention of Article 22(1) of the 1973 Constitution that disapproves teaching or forcing children to learn things against their own faith. The decision to make learning of Quran in universities in Punjab passed in June of this year, 2020. In Punjab, a province where 75% Christians live, will further impinge upon personal rights and create complications in relations, most possibly resulting in greater number of blasphemy cases, which is a big issue as far as minorities are concerned. In any case, there's a constant and deliberate portrayal of Hindus as enemies of the state and Indian agents. Blasphemy law is another window into to measure treatment of minority groups, like especially Christians and Ahmadiyya. I would say that this law, incorporated in the Penal Code in 1986, has victimized greater number of Muslims, and this is borne by data itself, but minority groups are obvious and natural victims. There is the famous case of Asia Bibi, who was jailed for 8 years under this law over a quarrel that started with her drinking water from a well. She was certainly lucky. Then the governor of Punjab was shot dead by his guard for speaking up for Asia Bibi. Or in 2018, a Christian boy who was killed by his schoolmates for doing the same thing, which is drinking water from the same glass as Muslim boys. Mind you, this is not, and I repeat, this is not about Islamic ideology, but how faith and violence comes together to exert influence and rearrange power at a local societal level. The bulk of the cases of blasphemy against Christians in particular revolve around possession of land or evicting the poor from a particular area. These are property issues. The Ahmadiyya, declared non-Muslim in 1974, are constantly under threat, almost as the Shias, who are Muslims, but who've experienced victimization since the 1980s. For example, since 2012, 509 Shias have been killed. I could go on and on giving details of expression of radicalism, but let me take you back to the analytical model to explain the phenomenon, especially as I argue that the driver is not religion or ideology, but its use in progressive elimination of rationality. Can we go to the next slide, please? Pakistan as a state can be categorized as a case of weak nationalism and strong religionism, where the primordial identity that formed the state was religion and not ethnicity. This was certainly a different formula for state making from what was used for the creation of European state system that was replicated in building states from former colonies after World War II. Pakistan was not exceptional, as religion was part of the primordial identity in other countries. An issue that puts South Asia at greater risk of radicalism is that these are faith-based societies with relatively less bias for scientific rationality. But while in other cases, as India in 1947, the state consciously redefined itself as a secular state, Pakistan, as historian Faisal Devji argues, embraced religious identity on par with ethnicity, the same as happened in Israel. This is also where Pakistan becomes different from Saudi Arabia, where Arab ethnicity remained a strong alternative identity. Religion was central, yet it was not central to identity of the Saudi state. Jinnah, it is important to note that despite his liberal values, rejected ethnic nationalism that he termed as curse of provincialism. And since then, the state of Pakistan has been embattled with provincial or multiple national identities of its people. An alternative source for national identity was rejected. In the process, a new religious nationalism constructed. There's a constant debate regarding what Jinnah wanted Pakistan to be. Did he want a theocracy? Did he want an Islamic state? But the ruling elite, but the ruling elite managed to achieve what took place in Israel as well. And to cite Yuri Ram about what happened in Israel, the transportation of Jewishness entirely from a religion of a nation to a national religion. In Pakistan, such transformation happened in several ways. And let me take you to that. Can we move to the next slide, please? In fact, after. Yeah. So I identify 7 waves, and let me go through it one by one, just to highlight how religious identity and radicalism got intertwined with Pakistani nationalism. Now, after creation of Pakistan, the critical period is 49 to 51, in which the objective resolution is passed. The engagement of Liaquat Ali government with Jamaat-e-Islami, the initial violence in the early 50s, is this first critical wave where the state begins to toy with religion to draw legitimacy for the ruling elite, and in the process set the society on the course of a politics that used religion or religious differences as the primary lens. This is what I call the pre-radical path. Can we go back to the last slide? So there are three, the parts of the process. There is creating a state in the name of religion sets it up, increases the propensity of what I call, this is the stage of pre-radicalism, moving towards latent radicalism and then active radicalism. And we'll see that as we go through the waves. Now you can go back to the next slide, please. So while the discussion of religion in the Pakistani state gets obfuscated by Muhammad Ali Jinnah's September 11th speech, in which he beckoned people to go to their places of worship with freedom, the state machinery, it seems, around him thought otherwise. From some of the of his sister Fatma Jinnah's biography of Jinnah, we learn that the speech was tempered with. Historical records indicate that Jinnah's press information officer, one Colonel Majid Malik, had a role in doing this, in this censoring the speech. The conflict with India in the 47-48 First War that led to the formation of the Kashmir conflict not only gave birth to a problem that would become Pakistan's existential crisis, but added to the inspiration to frame nationalism in strong religious overtones. Pakistan had to be turned into an Islamic state to look different from a Hindu India. The second wave begins in 1951. This is when religious identity, building of religious identity coincided with global geopolitical demands in Pakistan. There is speeding up of the Cold War in which Pakistan identifies itself with the West and the perceived threat from the communist Soviet Union, which led to greater engagement of the state with not only religion, but the religious clergy. The ruling elite did not engage with the primordial religious identity on the one hand, nor develop rational thought, but use religious identity as a tactical tool. Fighting communism required encouraging religious thought. Becoming member of the Central Treaty Organization in 1955 and later Southeast Asia Treaty Organization made religious nationalism a worthy cause. This was also the period that, driven by its need for acceptance as a Muslim state within the Islamic world, Pakistan built links with the more traditional states of the Arab world like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf instead of the secular Arab republics like Egypt. In 1962, the government started to move slowly towards institutionalizing religion in the form of setting up the Council of Islamic Ideology. Now, what's important to understand is that while this transformation, this slow movement is happening, the ruling elite is still imbibes colonial legacy in which secularism and liberalism were a given. General Ayub Khan could still think of declaring Pakistan in his second constitution of 1962 as a republic rather than an Islamic republic. Now, that had to be changed later due to resistance from the religious groups and parties. Already, the street power of the religious groups has begun to increase. The 1949, I mean, the building up of the power of religious groups has started with the 1949 Objective Resolution, which completely closed doors for secularism, but also brought in elements like the Jamaat-e-Islami that were keen to push back even the syncretic traditions and institutions. Clearly, the Sunni identity of the state had gained ground to a degree that even the founding fathers' legacy could not be declared as Shia. In 1951 judgment regarding his inheritance, he was stated as a Sunni, this is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, rather than a Shia. The third wave is from 68, 69 to 77. Using religious ideology for achieving geopolitical goals was further enhanced during this period. The partnership between Islamabad and Jamaat-e-Islami in East Pakistan dovetailed into the use of tribal warriors and militants to fight the 47-48 and then the 1965 wars. However, the most critical turn towards squeezing secularism out of the national identity was in September 1974 by the Zulfikar Ali Bhutto government. What started from the slogan of Islamic socialism by the Pakistan People's Party resulted in giving more space to religious groups on the streets. The modern state of Pakistan opted, in 1974, Ahmadis were declared non-Muslims. Now, through that decision, the modern state of Pakistan opted to adjudicate upon the faith of a citizen. I wouldn't get into the details of the decision or whether it was right or wrong. The decision, however, can be questioned on the basis of how it altered the nature of the state. This is when formally stepped into becoming a religious state. In the process, it started the duality between ideological identity, dependence of power on ideological legitimacy, and electoral politics. Religious parties in Pakistan, even today, can still not win elections without state support, but have tremendous street power that is borne on governments who often concede to pressure of the mullah. Incidentally, there was little effort made to rationalize and modernize the religious discourse. On the one hand, the syncretic religious tradition were rejected by the educated urban middle class, and on the other, the signal sent to the ordinary folk was that religious identity was acceptable as long as its source was modernized and made more textual. So this started to move away from its Sufi tradition. The left liberal segments proved equally lazy to understand the cultural norms that drove the society. As religion grew, it got rejected by the ever-shrinking left liberal elements. And this is where I see greater affinity between modern Turkey and Pakistan's movement, where left and liberals have equally contributed in some form or way of pushing secularism back. 1977 was beginning of yet another wave. The military government of Ziaul-Haq was in competition with the embrace of Islamic discourse of the Bhutto government. It tried to add greater flavor, and mind you, then religion nationalism had already taken root by Islamizing states' institutions. The Islamic laws introduced during the period with the help of some elements of the judiciary in partnership with the clergy took the form of major conversion. The Hudud Ordinance, Islamic banking, zakat and ushur, laws of inheritance, declaring a woman's witness as half of man, were some of the changes that did not stop with the general's departure, but continued until 1990. The Qisas and Diyat ordinance that were left out during General Zia's days were incorporated as an ordinance in 1990. And mind you, 1990 was also a period of great political instabilities. Political governments would come on for an average of 2 years and then would be pushed out, and constantly that forced them to give greater space to the religious clergy. Now, there are three developments that took place during this period, and I want to draw your attention towards it. First, the military regime engaged with all forms of religion, including the Sufi institutions, with the intention of sidelining any secular liberal influences. But in the process, religion in itself, in all its forms, was accepted. Second, the regime, in partnership with the more radical religious elements, rearranged societal faith. The literal and textual formulas of faith were preferred over the more organic Sufi traditions. This was accepted by the rising urban educated middle class that saw the more organic form as part of the old power structure. I mean, mind you, this is also a time when a new middle class and a new ruling elite is. Of radicalism, I would argue that had begun to be formalized in 1974 was further strengthened during this period. The process wasn't entirely top-down, but also influenced by emergence of what I have mentioned earlier, a new middle class and ruling elite that was far more grounded in religious primordialism. Last but not least, the regime's geopolitical role to fight communist USSR led to engaging with militancy. There was also the need to counter Iranian Shia influence. Thus, as historian Tahir Kamran has highlighted in his study, it was during this period that Deobandi and LA Hadith Madrasa proliferated in areas like South Punjab that earlier denoted a different religious tradition. I mean, it was a land of, it was seen as a land of Sufis, just like Sindh in the south is seen as a land of Sufis, but has changed. I wouldn't argue that there weren't radical values in Sufi Islam, but this is a conversation for another day. From 1990 to 2001, the major transformation of the state had already taken place. The ruling elite was conservative and the state institution driven by the instinct to use militancy to gain geopolitical goals. The defeat and later breakup of the Soviet Union in 1990 had driven a lesson home that militant non-state actors could defeat any military power. There were two fronts on which the state wanted to engage militants: Kashmir and Afghanistan. South Asia as a region was abandoned by the only surviving superpower, the USA, leaving sufficient room for Pakistan to engage with militancy. This is also another critical period for the growth of radicalism in the society, because the society was shifting gears towards becoming more comfortable with extremism and militancy. At one point during this period, which is 1990-2001, I remember there were 90 militant groups in Punjab alone. The madrasa that drew a lot of attention as a source of extremism and militancy was the hub to train the Taliban. Not later, because later on it was studied and proven that militants were also being taken from normal schools, government schools, which means secular schools, or from a seemingly secular educational system. There were numerous organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaatul Dawa Network, Harkatul Jihadul Islami, Harkatul Mujahideen, Harkatul Ansar, Jaish-e-Mohammed that emerged. Can you take us to the next slide, please? And there were several, you can see supportive slogans. And the next one, please. This is a slogan from Karachi. This is a highway in Punjab where I saw the slogan, pasted there in broad daylight in public eye to see, indicating not just the presence of these militant groups, but also the state support for it. The anchoring of Taliban in Afghanistan next door turned Pakistan, Afghanistan combined into a haven for radical militancy that attracted fighters from all across the Muslim world. Not just that, the militancy attracted patrons from across the Muslim world as well. In fact, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, which were averse to militants in their own homeland, used Afghanistan and Pakistan as a territory to park their religious zealots that could be trained and used to fight other ideological battles, especially between Riyadh and Tehran. During this period, poverty indeed was a contributory factor, especially in areas adversely neglected by the state. And I would like to draw attention towards, for example, the tribal areas and even South Punjab, where militancy grew. The upsurge of Taliban had an impact domestically as well. The targeted killing of Shia is a development that can be attributed to this period. In 1999, for example, there was targeted killing of Shia doctors in Karachi. And this was not just due to geopolitical objectives, but geopolitics allowing religious and militant groups to carry out ideological indoctrination based on separation of us and the other. And this was not happening, against minorities, between the majority and minority religious groups, but also within within Muslim groups as well. Now, this is a period of latent radicalism that we see getting planted rapidly in the society. Thus, the link between the sects that were visible in the start started to break. So while there was greater peace and stability, while when I was growing up in Pakistan, it was possible to see greater cohesion between Shias and Sunnis, that started to evaporate. Not to forget that the 1974 decision encouraged the latent radicalism that grew much more during this period. But a major shift came in the form of 9/11 and US war in Afghanistan. The ensuing conflict disrupted the connection between the Pakistani state and many of the militant groups and individuals that did not understand the shift in state policy. By 2001, Afghanistan and Pakistan's tribal areas were strewn with militant groups from across the Muslim world, including Arabs, Chechens, Uzbeks. You name it, they were there. The American war in Afghanistan, followed by the one against Iraq, created chasms at several levels. It was not just between the state and militants, but also within state institutions. There was mass confusion. Non-state actors could not read into the state's plan. And that thus began a conflict which continued unabated and in fact sharpened with the first military operation in Swat in 2009. Now, there is one perspective that war radicalized the society, which may be partly, which is partly true. The state that had built a national narrative in which West was an enemy matched the narrative developed by radical elements of Islam versus the Judeo-Christian civilizations. I'm always amazed to look at analysis which divides militant groups between those that fight in Kashmir versus others that have pan-Islamic ambition, or then there are those with sectarian agenda. I believe that all of these militant groups can do everything at the same time or at different times. And in fact, pan-Islamism has spread in most groups, with sectarian violence used more practically. But referring to confusion caused by the American war, one cannot note the impact at the state level. One cannot not note the impact at the state level where sufficient room was left for non-state actors and religious militancy. This is a period of much confusion. The various militant groups, as we see, expanded their socio-political networks in which they have a full-fledged societal presence. So if you look at this particular slide of 4 Islamic, sect-wide separation between these groups, they have their educational bodies, they have their parties, they have the political groupings, they have the militant groups. So there is an entire, each sect has its entire network. And not to say that where you see, for example, in Deobandi, you see Sunnat wal Jamaat, it's a political party, Hadith, Lashkar-e-Taiba, etc. In 2018 elections, they had they introduced their political parties. Now, this does not mean that they're entirely dependent on their own political strength. It's very interesting that despite their street power, these political forces these militant radical groups do not actually translate that support on the street politically. They do not even venture to do that. And therefore, they are equally connected with national parties like the Pakistan People's Party, PMLN, or PTI. The linkages are very much there at individual and group level. This networking that you see here is critical because it has the potential to penetrate the emerging middle class in smaller towns and societies. In fact, I would argue that the ambition and religious inclination of the middle class is a major driver of radicalism rather than the poor and they're driven by their poverty. This development, this this build-up of networking and connection with the middle class is a development which coincided with weakening of the state as people increasingly turn towards militant groups for alternative and speedy justice or simple intervention. Now, my last, the last wave, which is 2009 to date, Pakistan fought from a period from 2009 to 2014, Pakistan fought 4 military operations that have substantially reduced violence in the country. However, this has not impacted radicalism, which is driven by 3 interdependent factors. First, the strategic goals of the state, which may have shifted slightly as far as militancy is concerned, but they have not altered fundamentally. You can still see militants in reduced numbers, but still have value for the state. Second, the geopolitical influences are negative. South Asia is emerging as a turbulent region, which will get increased and will increasingly get, become more turbulent. For Pakistan, there are 2 challenges. The Hindutva in India, its rise, is not just considered a major threat, but is a serious provocation. This is followed by the emerging geostrategic landscape in which there is US-China conflict on one hand, and then the new Sino-Indian rivalry, which will keep the region turbulent. There is no cause for the state to rethink its strategy on militancy and resultantly radicalism, or resultantly engage with radicalism. This also means that there will continue to be room for both militants and militancy. Third, latent radicalism has spread into society, with the state having little capacity or inclination to control the development. The propagation of religion through a more textual and literal framework has pushed back syncretic values. Traditions that were more organic were ignored, not developed, and pushed back. Can you take us to the next slide, please? And very quickly, I would like you to have a view of the different militant groups, the different violent extremist group, their linkages with the state, or whether they are in a relationship of conflict or cooperation, or both conflict and cooperation. I mean, this is a relationship which has influenced the society. Now, very quickly, let me take you to my last 2 slides, and then I'll be over with my presentation. So what are drivers and versus contributors as far as radicalism is concerned? Very simply, religion, with its contribution in creation of nationalism, is a major force. Religion has been part of state policy. The problem, I'd repeat, is not with religion or faith or people following faith per se, but how it's used to negotiate power within at the societal level. And that's where it has been problematic for Pakistan. There's geopolitical goals of the state, there is weakening of the state, and emergence of a new middle class that has contributed to, which has actually used religion for the same purposes as the ruling elite. So if you look at areas like Sindh, which were known for the Sufi tradition, the emerging middle class is much more, thinks differently and is much more driven towards radical values than towards the more peaceful Sufi traditions of the society. Then, of course, there are contributors like poverty. Let me see. There is poverty. There is the youth bulge. There is a tremendous rise in. With the rising population, there is a large part of Pakistan's population, newer population, is youth. So their education or the kind of education that is imparted to them, there are several problems, and we can discuss it in Q&A. So all of these are contributors, not the drivers. That takes me to the last slide and my last point, which is, can Pakistan turn around? I would say that Pakistan makes an important case. It's an important case study to learn from how integration of religion in state politics, how it drives a society. Is it possible then, once you are so engaged, once religion is so engaged with politics, is it possible to disengage from this process? And the answer at this point in time is no. There is massive political instability which does not stop the use of religion for power. Be it the political parties, even seemingly non-religious parties like the PPP, for instance, or the PMLN. PMLN is conservative, but PPP, which has tradition of being less conservative, even there's a tendency to use religion for political gains. So the question is that, be it Pakistan or any country which begins to toy with religion, is it possible to change it? And the answer, I repeat, is no. Change cannot happen until modernity and rational engagement is not introduced in the society. And that cannot happen without encouraging alternative identity. A lot depends upon the ruling elite not using faith for power. But even with all good intentions, this is not a speedy process. I think for me, when I was thinking about how do a way out, I was reminded of Iran, of Shah's Iran, for instance, where speedy modernity, a fast-paced modernity without stable local political and social structures, that journey towards fast-paced journey towards modernity can collapse. De-radicalization, mind you, is a conversation which ought to be started, but it's also a process that will take decades of political stability and decades of programming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a wonderful presentation. We have got lots of questions because people are there watching on Facebook Live, though we had some disturbance. We managed to control it. How would you like to go? Like, we can have questions one by one, or maybe 2-3 questions, and then you can answer them.
Can we have 2-3 questions?
Yeah,
okay. Can we have 2-3 questions?
Sure, ma'am. So the first question is, how the radicalization in Pakistan affected political stability and the future of democracy in Pakistan? Is this also affecting South Asian security scenario? This is the first question. Second is, has the tendency of radicalization come down to any extent after Imran Khan took over the prime ministership?
Has
the tendency of radicalization come down after Imran Khan government? And third is, do you find any line of difference between the nature of radicalization that existed in India and Pakistan?
Okay. See, let me start with a more important first question, which is the link between democracy and the impact radicalism has on political stability or instability in Pakistan. See, the problem with religion, with the use of faith for politics, is that the contestation over faith soon turns the conversation violent. On politics, when if we have disagreement on politics, we can still be violent. We can still a secular conversation can also get out of hand. But when it is matter of God, the propensity of violence increases. And the problem is that with religious political matters, when states are weak, when there is no form, there is no methodology to negotiate, then what do? Then violence becomes it becomes more significant. Let me quickly give an example of blasphemy law itself. I mean, for example, many people have argued about it, that blasphemy law can be rationalized. For example, how evidence is collected, who is accusing, the identity, the character of the person accusing another of blasphemy. There are changes that can be brought. However, what we've seen is that anybody questioning blasphemy law, which is seen as the word of God, which it's not. I mean, it can be debated. However, there's very little for debate. And that kind of an environment, I mean, I'm giving you an example that if you just focusing on how blasphemy law is used in Pakistan indicates how unstable it can make a system, because the political system or the secular system cannot push back. Very recently, there is this case of a professor, a very well-known Sindhi professor from in one of the universities in Sindh, and she simply questioned. A colleague was one of her colleagues was accused of blasphemy law, and she simply questioned and said that she questioned the law, which is a man-made law, not a God-made law, and she was attacked. I mean, she was viciously attacked, and she had to then she submit an apology, a verbal apology. And all that happening. So religion and politics, the violence that it produces does bring greater instability. It has a direct impact on the nature of democracy, on the nature of politics. And yes, so there is impact on Pakistan. Now, what impact does it have on South Asia? See, at this point in time, South Asia has become, and I link it with the third question, that do I see commonalities between what's happening in Pakistan and what's happening in India? And the problem with the Pakistani case that I've presented today is that Pakistan may have had a start, but it's very interesting that India seems to have arrived under BJP, where Pakistan started in 1947. Despite the secular traditions, India could not make a move. And the problem, which I have briefly tried to discuss in my presentation as well, is that the primordial identity of people in South Asia in general is linked with religion. Now, there is very little rationality or very little space for scientific rationality. And that hasn't happened. A movement has not happened in India despite years of secularism. And political instability the issues of, or the problems of the distributive national resource distributive process, the difference between, the poverty gap, etc. There are all these issues which have kind of turned India the same way, in the same direction as Pakistan in 1947. And of course, countries or political systems learn from each other as well. So there is similarity, and because there is similarity, and where the two countries stand today, it increases the risk of instability. It increases the risk of conflict. Sadly, it increases the risk of conflict. I mean, radical India and a radical Pakistan do not give any sense of encouragement to to the citizens. To the second question on what has happened, has radicalism reduced since Imran Khan came? I mean, I would like to remind whoever has asked this question that Imran Khan is popularly known in Pakistan as Taliban Khan because of his particular understanding of how radical elements have to be dealt with. The issue with his position is not religion, but using religion to counter his opponents, using religion in his political competition. And so that makes him technically not very different from others in the past that have used the same tactic. But sadly, as I mentioned earlier, that Pakistan, while the counter-terrorism results have been very encouraging, violence has been brought down, counter-terrorism or CT lens is not the right framework to understand where radicalism stands, or what is the future of radicalism in the country.
Let's move to next set of questions. Why is radicalism present in Pakistan religious in nature rather than political, which is more oriented towards change rather than conservatism? Second is, has Pakistan become a better place for minorities after Imran Khan became the Prime Minister? And third is, what is the role of civil society in rise of radicalism in Pakistan?
Has better and sorry, what was the third question?
A role of civil society in rise of radicalism in Pakistan.
Okay. So the first one was on religious political change.
Yes, political in nature. Sorry, it's religious in nature rather than political
radicalism. Right. Now let me start with the second question, which is, has Pakistan become a better place under Imran Khan? I think the question comes from somebody who's probably not heard the presentation. And what I've been saying is that actually not. I mean, radicalism has got so integrated into the political system that everybody used it, from the PPP at times to PMLN and PTI run by Imran Khan. So their statements, some statements are there to kind of give more comfort to minorities by different parties. But PTI and Imran Khan are certainly not good news for minorities in Pakistan. He claims to be modern, but his ability, and especially at this juncture when he's increasingly becoming more unstable, weaker, it's not possible to expect him to, to deliver to minorities. So the answer is no. I mean, there is no evidence that after his arrival, things have changed. For example, in 2019, as I mentioned, 200 Christians had from a mob. There have been, in 2019, 24 Shia Hazaras were killed. So, there are small but constant instances of violence against minority groups. Now, political radicalism versus religious radicalism. Of course, there is political radicalism as well, which the state seems to be, in a better mood to fight at least some of it. For example, the story of MQM, the Muttahida Qawmi movement, the ethnic party that held forth and which had tremendous power given by the military starting from the 1980s. I mean, MQM was a party which the military generals claimed that was created by General Ziaul. And the amount of violence that it used, of course, we've seen it. MQM is also accused of being funded by Indian intelligence. So there's all of that. And the state seems to have been in a better mood to contest that, to push back, the MQM, for example. I mean, it took them years, but they've managed to clean Karachi, urban Sindh, of violence of MQM. MQM politically is still there, but in a much weaker position. There is, of course, there is in Balochistan, you have Baloch insurgency as well. I wouldn't say that, if you compare, with other countries of the region, Pakistan's political radicalism is there, but is less serious of a problem than religious radicalism. But in both cases, I think it's important to understand that both radicalisms, in one way or the other, are a net result of how the state has engaged with political identities or ethnic identities on one hand, and with religious identity on the other. Religious radicalism is encouraged because the state has very little capacity, and over years the state has surrendered its capacity to engage with the issue of rationalizing religious discourse. There is now very little capacity to rationalize religious discourse. I mean, recently, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, there was an effort, the government, in its good intent, decided to build a Hindu temple in Islamabad. Of course, Hindus are part of Pakistan's population, and why not? Especially when Muhammad Ali Jinnah said that all religious groups were welcome to worship, and they were welcome as citizens of Pakistan. However, what we saw then very shortly was that the street power of the clergy pushed back the government. It was unable to do anything. It has cowed down. The temple so far is not being built. And the same goes for relations with other minority groups. Now, as compared to that, what we see in terms of political radicalism, especially if we focus on a place like Balochistan, it's purely a political problem which has been mishandled, mismanaged, and there is this lack of conversation. So authoritarianism in any state of South Asia, firstly, most states in South Asia are authoritarian, if not military authoritarian, civil authoritarian. And in this authoritarian environment, the absence of negotiation does naturally then bring radicalism. And Pakistan is no different. But I would say that while it has greater propensity to fight political radicalism, there is much less intent of doing the same, for religious radicalism. Now, what's a of civil society. See, part of the, one of the results of this growing radicalism is, and strengthening and strengthening of weakening of weakening of political institutions and strengthening of the military has resulted of weakening of civil society as well. Pakistan's civil society today is weak, not just to negotiate with its authoritarian military, but also weak to negotiate with religious groups. What do you do? And now the two sides of the problem. One is that, yes, because of the instability, because of the way Pakistan's politics has grown, therefore civil society has weakened and has no power. But there's also the issue of the secular and more liberal elements of the society that have been unable to engage with religion. I mean, after all, religion was part of primordial identity of the society. You cannot say that, these societies are not faith-based. From India to Sri Lanka to Pakistan to Bangladesh, these are all faith-based societies. But how do you bring in rationality? I mean, there is rationality in societal thought and also rationality in the religious discourse. That engagement between the civil society and religion or religious groups did not ever happen. Simply rejecting faith or simply rejecting religion as simply rejecting or not accepting this fact that religion is important to our societies doesn't help the civil society or the liberal element of the civil society negotiate. So what you have now is a very confrontational relationship. In Pakistan, for example, today, as you may have noted in the beginning of the presentation, the remarks that were written by people on Facebook, that in itself indicated the low level of tolerance and the absence of dialogue. Liberals are considered as, they are considered as, as enemies of the state, enemies of the society. They are constantly being pushed. And on the other hand, from the liberal elements, there is no engagement with reality of the society itself. So this is where we stand at the moment. And one last point, in some ways, this is very similar to, as I mentioned earlier, like Turkey, where the constant use of religion by authoritarian military on the one hand, and the partnership between liberal elements of the society and the military actually resulted in strengthening of religious radical elements. AKP, Erdogan's AKP and other religious political parties in Turkey grew mainly because religion was the only space for the common man.
Let's go to the next round of question, ma'am. Do you think that Pakistan government decision to mainstream the Fatah will tackle the problem of radicalism and militancy in Pakistan? Second, what role does Pakistan army or military play in radicalism in Pakistan? And third is, did our participation in Afghanistan war contributed to the radicalization of Pakistan?
I would say not just 2001 war in Afghanistan, but this goes back to the 1980s, the first war in Afghanistan. That's when the seeds for radicalism formally, much more formally were sown. I would not say that radicalism started then, but I would say that it speeded up then. I mean, 1980s, we are very critical of Ziaul Haq, as we ought to be, yet we forget that the geopolitical environment in which Ziaul Haq Islamized the society or speeded up the process of Islamization of the society, that was acceptable in the wider, geopolitical, global geopolitical environment. The United States and its allies had to fight the war in Afghanistan, for which, and the policy, and since the American policy was not to put boots on ground, I mean, that policy shift had come after Nixon. Uh, Pakistan was given money, but also encouraged to, to make use of, to harness its society to fight that war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is, yes, fundamental to the change that has come about in Pakistan. So 1980s, there were madrasas that were opened. The ideology, I mean, there were textbooks, madrasa textbooks, from school textbooks actually, made in the University of Nebraska, that were flown in, that actually made images, that propagated images related with jihad. Uh, uh, for example, Bay was not Bakri Islam, but Bay was Banduk, things like that. So yes, Afghanistan is fundamental. Role of the military, tremendous role. I mean, what I've been trying to say during my presentation is that starting from 47, 48, which is use of tribals, with that were religious zealots as well. From the use of tribals in 47, 48 war in Kashmir to 1965, and then in Kargil, militants, and especially the period from 1990 onwards, when Kashmir started to, when troubles started in the Kashmir Valley, militants have been used consistently. There has been this engagement, and there's been a very costly engagement as far as the society is concerned. Now, will that change with merger of FATA into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa? See, merger is, there is, on the one hand, there is politics of merger, which doesn't give one hope. I mean, for example, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, PTM, the small group or the small movement which is contesting for its rights, contesting for greater accountability of security decisions in its region, is far more critical and far more important. We know, and what we've heard from sources is that militants, the Taliban, members of the Haqqani network, or Pakistan-based groups are actually resurfacing in areas which are part of, FATA. So while a law has been passed, the fundamental policy is not changed. So unless that policy is changed, unless there is greater accountability of security decision-making, unless militant groups are not allowed to use that territory, FATA would remain the same. There is a lot of development, there is a lot of socioeconomic development, there is infrastructure development to happen in FATA, and unless that happens, I don't see that having an effect. Also, one very quick point, from what I have guessed, from this question, FATA may be a nod, a point in the overall radicalism map in Pakistan, but the only primary node. It's not the only primary point. There is radicalism, there's far greater radicalism in Punjab that does not get talked about. There is increasing radicalism in Sindh, which we do not hear about, especially since the successful counter-terrorism operation. So, and you know, the forced conversion of Hindu girls, or treatment of Christians, the minorities, this remains like a primary window through which we look at how society is radicalized. So while stability in FATA in the areas bordering on Afghanistan will of course help, yet that is not the only problem which Pakistan suffers from.
Let's go to next round of question. What is the role of madrasa education? How the role of madrasa education contributed to the radicalization of Islamic culture in Pakistan? What role has the prevailing education system played in normalizing radicalization among the youth of Pakistan? That is one. Second is, how is radicalism affecting Pakistan's foreign policy? And third is, how the ethnic conflicts becoming a baseline for radicalism in Pakistan.
How is?
Ethnic conflicts becoming a baseline for radicalism in Pakistan.
Okay. And ethnic conflicts. Madrasa's contribution in radicalism, I think that this is a subject that has been done and dusted with long ago, but let me revisit it. Madrasas, especially in the early days, the 1980s, for instance, had played an important role. It produced the Taliban, it produced a whole set of militants that went and fought in Afghanistan or Kashmir or other fronts. Yet, there was a lot of undue attention that it brought to madrasas being the sole providers of militants. In fact, we found out that militants were actually being taken from government or secular educational system as well. The whole instance of 9/11 itself tells us something, that madrasas, I mean, the people, the hijackers, were not part of, they were all educated. I mean, they were university educated people. And the same goes for Pakistan. Now, having said that, let me also say that madrasas are very critical. Madrasas are the base, the power base of different militant religious networks. So the table that I showed you of different sects and their respective networks, each sect, Deobandi, Ahle Hadith, Shias, Barelvi, each one has their educational board which run the madrasas. I mean, they considered madrasas as very critical, and they do not allow any government to touch madrasas. I mean, there's a constant negotiation between different governments, successive governments, and these madrasa boards about registering madrasas or any state intervention in the curriculum. Now, on the one hand, while there is some agreement on registering of madrasas, these networks, these religious groups completely reject intervention, any formal intervention. In fact, the British and American governments, USAID, DFID, have invested billions into reprogramming madrasas, which has not happened. think, I mean, personally, I think it's a very flawed proposition as well. Madrasas, their teacher base, their curriculum, it's all problematic, but it's also important to understand that this is the power base of each network. I mean, to give you an example, politically, the political mobilization that can be brought through these madrasas. One example from Murree, which is the hill station near Islamabad, Pakistan's capital, to Islamabad, which is about 22 kilometers. The number of madrasas you can actually get in a single day, you can get 50 to 60,000 students to gather on the roads of Islamabad. So if you want to actually push a government, that's your force. So that's why these groups do not. I mean, for me, madrasas are problematic for the way they can be used politically and for how they form a force behind every network. But turning to the other question of educational system, I mean, there is a problem of Pakistan's education system being less rational. I mean, the history that we teach, and again, this is a problem that increasingly is emerging throughout South Asia. As far as social sciences is concerned, as far as histories are concerned, South Asian states and the societies the states have begun to lie societies. They have begun to take their people into that black hole where they are fed on lies about history, about half-truths, and encouraged to draw on those problematic, incorrect histories to further build animosity, to further develop an enemy image, which ultimately leads to instability in the region. So Pakistan, again, going back to Pakistan is no different, and I would say Pakistan has had a head start. The history that we teach, there is less rationality. I mean, I remember, let me give you an example. I was helping a nephew take an exam for 10th grade. And when I started looking at the syllabi, English syllabi, mind you, not religious studies, not Islamic studies, English syllabi, I figured out that 19 out of the 32 lessons were directly linked with religion. Rest of them were to do with Pakistan's perception of its statehood. Now, if that's a narrow worldview that you teach, then there is a problem. The other issue, which I think where Pakistan is adversely affected, is lack of scientific education. That has to increase. That has to be there for an education system to counter. And so now, radicalism and foreign policy. Now, I think that's where there has been a shift in Pakistan's foreign policy. Pakistan is connected with Saudi Arabia. Pakistan is connected with Iran is next door neighbor. I think, but the traces of radicalism cannot be found in Pakistan's foreign policy there. The relationship with India is where you would say that traces of that radicalism or impact of radicalism has on foreign policy, but then it's also a matter of Pakistan existential, it's the existential threat. That is how things have been since 1947. In the past 5 to 10 6 years, what we've seen is that foreign policy is determined much more by very rational, but Pakistan's needs. So on the one hand, it has excellent relations with China, which is communist, which is non-Muslim, and where you have the Uyghur problem, the problem faced by Uyghurs, Muslims in China, and that is an issue on which Pakistan government does not take any position. In a very recent interview, of Prime Minister Imran Khan, somebody asked him this question about Uyghur Muslims, and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't know." So he had to pretend that the does not exist, because the need of keeping good relations with China dictate that that issue is ignored. Now, this is very different from how it happened in Afghanistan during the 1980s. It's very different from the position that is taken vis-a-vis, for example, Palestinians. I mean, where you see Pakistan's religious values having an effect is actually in its relation with, in its foreign policy on, for example, Israel. It's almost impossible at this juncture for Pakistan to have diplomatic relations with Israel. Not at the foreign policy level, at the societal level, you see criticism. There is an increasing and stark criticism and continues to have relations with, fairly satisfactory relations with the United States. The problems that are created between USA and Pakistan are due to different reasons, not because of its religious values or religious politics. Now, ethnic conflict, this question has made me think, what happens when, as we've seen in the case of Turkey, when religion becomes the only way or only legitimate way of airing your concerns or, indicating, talking about your suffering. The reason, I talk about Turkey is that at some level, this is the transition that in some parts of Pakistan as well, like Balochistan. I mean, Balochistan, which where the society has been for years been very secular. Historically, it's been more secular, less inclined towards religion, or if there is any inclination towards religion, it's much more the syncretic tradition. But what we've seen there is infiltration of that space by militant groups, which is allowed by the state on the one hand, but that then gives an indicator that the only thing which will work, that the only thing which will matter is religious identity. Increasingly, we see Baloch getting inducted into militant groups. The face of conflict will change. Now that is being done intentionally to bring in, that linearity, to bring in, to kind of, I mean, the state's intention is to build a singular identity, which is Pakistani Islamiyat. I would say it's different from pan-Islamism. It does kind of, it kind of does connect with pan-Islamism, but Pakistani states, focuses more Pakistani Islamiyat. And it wants to build that. It wants to transform ethnic conflict and change it and change thinking of the people by encouraging greater religious identity. ethnic conflict will continue. It may become, it will acquire other colors. Al-Qaeda, for instance, when was it? During the mid 2010, I remember that, which is beginning of this decade. I remember reading a magazine, an article written in English, published by Al-Qaeda, which propagated, that Pakistan, since Pakistan did not meet its promise and turn into an Islamic state, Balochistan should, and that in fact, Balochistan supported and joined Pakistan because with the expectation that would become an Islamic state. So when Pakistan cannot, Balochistan should. So what radical groups are also attacking the ethnic identity and claiming, a piece of the pie. So eventually, the face of ethnic conflict may change as well. The problem may remain, but the face could change.
Let's move to the next round of questions. We still have 10 to 15 minutes. What is the role of external, or you can say geopolitical factor in radicalization in Pakistan? Second, what is the status of minorities in Pakistan? How are the rights of minorities addressed in the Constitution of Pakistan? And third is, how much has radicalization of Pakistan affected the internal government and institutions and the power equation within Pakistan?
Well, I would say these are questions being asked by people who have probably not, who have either skipped the presentation or not listened to it. Geopolitics is a major player. Geopolitics, starting from 1960s, as I mentioned, the two wars, the wars with India, the American war in Afghanistan during the 1980s. But before that, and my argument in my presentation has been that 1951, the American contestation against Russian communism encouraged the Pakistani military terms of greater, building relationship with the West, with the United States, but in the process, then encourage Islamic identity. 1951, there was this whole case. The military leadership had started to build a case that there was an attack on the military, there was an attack on the Pakistani society by communist forces, by leftist communist forces, and therefore, in order to secure, what is the next best option, which is to encourage Pakistan's religious identity and thus bring it much more central to, to politics, to the politics of the state. So yes, Afghanistan of the 1980s is fundamental. It did not, and in many ways, while religious identity was being built up during the 1980s or before that to fight communism, 9/11 theoretically was a different scenario altogether. I mean, 9/11 was meant to kind of dilute that religious identity and build a more modern, perhaps a more westernized Pakistan, which General Pervez Musharraf did try to do. However, that itself brought the kind of reaction which further entrenched radicalism in the society. you cannot, my point in my presentation was that de-radicalization is a dialogue with the society. It's a dialogue within the society. It's a dialogue. It cannot happen without a dialogue between the state and society with very confirmed goals. If you want to, if the objective is to rationalize the society, how it's to be done, what is the methodology, what are the partnerships, a new framework has to be devised. And anywhere that states have rushed into de-radicalization, into modernity, forget about de-radicalization, anywhere where states have tried to convert traditional non-rational thinking societies towards modernity, as it has happened in Iran, or as there may be a danger of some in Saudi Arabia. The same problem could be, you could have the same problems. The same problems that General Musharraf faced. There was a reaction. A fast-paced shift is not possible. Now, minorities, what happens to minorities in Pakistan? In fact, my argument during my presentation was that radicalism is no more obvious in the Pakistani state system than in its treatment of minorities. I mean, although there are rights, minorities have rights, they're fundamental rights. There is Article 22(1) of the 1973 Constitution, which I mentioned, according to which minorities cannot be taught or cannot be cannot be taught any other thing, any other text which is adverse to, or which is different from their own religious text. The other is that blasphemy law itself applies as much to to all other religions as to Islam, especially to Christianity and Judaism. So any adverse comments against Christ is as much punishable by the same law as against any disrespect shown to the Prophet of Islam or other important figures of Islam. How this is a problem. I indicated in my presentation that the employment data shows that there is a bias against religious minorities. There is only 2.98% of the workforce of the federal government is non-Muslim. That is one indicator. The educational system has a bias against minorities. And every time, I mean, any time and every time Pakistan government makes a claim about its liberal values, I think one needs to consult what is happening with minorities. There is this increasing and that has happened because there is because there is rising radicalism. There was this last question. There was this third question about government, something to do with the government.
Third question was like how much has how much has radicalization of Pakistan affected the internal government and institutions within Pakistan, basically in the power.
Internal government and internal
government and institutions and the power equation within Pakistan.
Of course, it has affected. Radicalism has affected, and again, when I say radicalism, please let me repeat over and over again. Radicalism is faith, about central faith is of religious discourses to distribution of resources to maneuvering of power and the power structure. So, for instance, if you look at Pakistan's judiciary, increasingly, it has been affected by the radical instinct, and the studies of Pakistan judiciary show, in fact, that increasingly, in order to push back military, in order to push back authority, in order to negotiate much more forcefully with the legislative or with the executive, judiciary, which is the third major instrument of the state, has increasingly adopted religion, has fallen back on religious discourse. I mean, some of the decisions that have come out indicate how judiciary as an institution has been affected. The Mukhtara Mai case, for example, about this woman from South Punjab, her gang rape. I mean, these are decisions which are worth reading to see how the thinking has shifted. 1980s, the whole array of Islamic laws under Ziaul Haq, they were not just created by the general, but they were created by the general with help of significant judges of the Supreme Court. Institutions change. I mean, I remember early 2000s, senior generals would talk about in brief American journals of how 16 to 17% of senior army officers had religious extremist tendencies. So naturally, I mean, there is no way to ascertain those claims made by generals themselves. Yet the fact is that in numerous cases, we have seen presence of military personnel, junior military personnel engaged with militants. For example, Malala Yousafzai, the young Nobel laureate from Pakistan who was attacked by Taliban, was threatened by a Talib who was a former military officer. So there were, and that in itself does not indicate that the entire army has radicalized. I mean, there is still that, because of its institutional discipline, it's still not completely changed, converged, and become militant. Yet, I'm not arguing that it's not radical. For example, the treatment, the societal relationship between Muslims and Christians within armed forces are not above board. I mean, I remember hearing from a friend, who works in the military and who happens to be Christian, that, their Muslim colleagues come, when they come to visit them, because they believe it's antithetical to Islamic values. They'll eat the Christmas cake, but they won't say Merry Christmas. So these are small examples to indicate that the thinking, the mood of the society is influenced by how religious politics or religious nationalism has grown. Pakistan was made for Muslims of South Asia, to provide them economic opportunities. Yet what we see and the way religion has been played is that instead of Islam being religion of a nation, it has been transformed to religious nationalism, which is much more radical, much more potent, and much more averse to a peaceful negotiation with other religious identities.
Let's move to the last round of questions. We still have more than 50 questions, but let me take 4 for the last round. What steps are taken by Pakistan to counter radicalism in Pakistan? The second is, what are the spillover effect of radicalism in Pakistan on the neighboring countries like India? Third is, do you see any shift in radicalism from the religious extremism to ethnic nationalism, like attacks on security forces in Balochistan and Karachi, the capital of Sindh province?
Can we skip that and take, because I've done it, can we take another question?
Yes. And last is, don't you think that radicalism in Pakistan is partly because of secular liberal elite that failed in providing socio-economic development plans for the people of Pakistan and insincerely use religion as a tool for social control?
All right, what steps are taken for radicalism? As I mentioned in my presentation, none. There is counter-terrorism, but CT, counter-terrorism, is a very problematic lens. I mean, when you reduce violence, it takes focus away from, from radicalism as a problem. We hear about, things being peaceful, things being normal, and nobody actually looks at the factor, which is radicalism, which affects interpersonal relations. And for that, there is no plan. You need political stability. You remind you that in terms of, how do you de-radicalize? I mean, we have a situation where even Muslims fail to have a conversation about Islam or Islamic issues. Can I, as a Muslim, actually sit down and in Pakistan talk about blasphemy? The answer is no, I cannot. There have been many, many, many instances where people have tried to question the issue of blasphemy. And blasphemy, that issue is important because it generates violence. It tends to generate violence. So if people have tried to talk about it and have either died, have been killed, as in case of the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, or Shehbaz Bhatti, the Christianist, they've had to really, grovel for, for appeasement with the radical elements. So the problem is that within Islam, between Muslims, a conversation is not possible. It's not happening. And part of the problem is that there is that radicalism. There is no one, the state is unstable to ensure that a dialogue happens. I think one of the issues is that there is, the problematic rule of law. The state should be able to not choose between ideologies. And that's where the problem with Pakistan lies, that in 1974, it decided that it would adjudicate on part with. But even if at this stage, the state decides that it would want to be neutral, remain neutral to religious ideologies, sects, whatever, let people have conversation. What we need is absolute implementation of rule of law. So irrespective of who you are, irrespective of what your faith or belief system is, if you're on the wrong, you'll be proceeded against. Now, that is not happening because the state remains weak in the face of radicalism. It does not understand, in fact, that radicalism is causing this problem, not necessarily militancy. Militancy can be quieted, militancy can be wrapped up, but it can be as long as there. So, and what we saw is that, progressive religious scholars, for example, under General Musharraf, who was otherwise promoting moderate Islam, after his departure, we saw, one religious scholar, Professor Ghamdi, who used to come on television. But afterwards, we saw that he had to leave the country. The state itself, the state institutions use blasphemy as a tool to to go after people, to attack its critics, its political critics. So there is a problem. So no steps. I mean, firstly, there are no steps, and no steps are sufficient. State is weak. Pakistani radicalism spilling into India, I would say that India has sufficient radicalism of its own. And due to its particular politics, there has been emergence of BJP and emergence of Hindutva, which may have fed on on the war between India and Pakistan, which may have fed on radicalism from Pakistan, but that is not the main cause, the main source. Hindutva's radicalism connected, but in largely internally driven. So while a case can always be made of spillover, and there's always a spillover. I mean, for example, in Pakistan today, maybe 10 years ago, I could be very critical of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa. I mean, today, I see many of the colleagues, educated, liberal, so-called liberal, secular, actually supporting Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa kind of networks because of Hindutva next door. So from that perspective, yes, there is a spillover, there may have been a spillover, but these phenomenons, the radicalisms are very internally driven as well. The relationship between the ruling elite and the people, how politics in India has evolved, it's a total different subject, which I'm sure Dr. Jaswal will get somebody from India to talk about it. Secular liberal, I mean, that is something one has repeatedly, that actually it's the secular and liberal in Pakistan who have had a role in producing radicalism. See, firstly, the Pakistani state, when they say secular liberal, when anybody says secular liberal, what they actually instinctively mean is the civil society. And I would argue that it's not fair to say that these people have been the source, the civil society has been the source of radicalism in Pakistan. It has been the state and state institutions. Now, one could argue that state institutions themselves are liberal because they're not entirely Islamic, or that they have this secular propensity. The Pakistani military stands somewhere in the middle, for example. It has the capacity to be very Islamic. It's driven by Islamic principles, yet it can be fairly liberal in its decision making. Now, that doesn't make the state institution secular. And I would say that it would be unfair to look state. There has been this battle. In fact, what has generated radicalism is this tug of war in which religious groups and religious conservative elements or who are part of the ruling elite, who are definitely part of the ruling elite, have tried to push against or to bring about transformation of the state to a more formal theocratic structure. So what we have today is, and in the process have produced a hybrid theocracy. I would repeat, Pakistan is a hybrid theocracy. It's not a liberal state. So if liberal secular forces are not in power, how can one argue that they have actually threatened the state? The liberal left, for example, is very weak. Liberal elements in the society can argue. Liberal elements in the society, they do, get a chance to speak. The debate, we've had arguments during the war after 9/11. There was this contestation of whether there were elements that were arguing that drone strikes were they should happen, they should be encouraged, and that argument itself was it got a counter argument. So liberal forces do keep saying, but they're not a powerful force in itself. What we see is a transformation. I mean, from a point in 1947 when the colonial legacy was still fundamental. Over years, over the 70 years, the nature of the ruling elite in Pakistan has changed. The primordialism, religious primordialism, you have now an elite which are much more ingrained in religious primordialism. So, but to finish my my answer, I don't think that liberal secular elements in the society have been that threat. I would argue, my gripe with these forces is that they ought to have engaged with the primordial identity, which is, where faith is very what that like people everywhere else in other countries of South Asia. Yet to say that secular forces were ever a threat, I think that's a bit unfair.
Thank you, Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa. It was a wonderful presentation. All of us benefited from the lecture. We got a lot. We got to learn a lot. We hardly get to hear these things here in Nepal. We'd like to thank you for your time, and we hope to have you again in future. We'd also like to thank all our participants for their questions. Basically, those who are watching us on Facebook Live today. Hope to see you again. Have a nice day. Thank you.